When a nation makes a strategic decision, it is not merely engineering steel, circuitry, or destructive capacity. It is, at its core, engaging in a profound act of vision, one that echoes across generations and reshapes how the world perceives it. The creation of a missile for India was never just a technological advancement. It was a statement of intent, a declaration that the nation had matured into an entity that could see beyond immediate necessity. That kind of foresight is rare because most nations, like most individuals, are consumed by short-term desires and crises. To think long-term is to step outside the immediacy of fear and chaos. It requires discipline, restraint, and a willingness to sacrifice comfort for security. India, in this regard, demonstrated something remarkable. It looked beyond the present moment to secure its future. This is not merely strength, it is wisdom embodied. When we examine the act of building a missile, it is tempting to reduce it to an instrument of war, a tool for destruction, a weapon to wield against enemies. But to stop at that interpretation would be to miss the deeper essence of the act. A missile, particularly one crafted with the explicit purpose of deterrence, is less about launching and more about preventing. It says to the world, here is a nation that cannot be ignored. Here is a people who will not be bullied. Here is sovereignty reinforced with precision. That message resonates more powerfully than any speech, any plea, or any diplomatic gesture ever could. And when you consider India's position in the global order, surrounded by adversaries and historical pressures, such foresight is not only intelligent but essential. It is what transforms vulnerability into stability. It is what prevents chaos from descending. It is what separates a nation at risk from a nation in command of its destiny. Now, think of foresight in terms of individual lives, for nations are only collections of individuals bound together by shared responsibility. The person who cannot plan ahead, who cannot anticipate consequences, who cannot act today in service of tomorrow. Such a person will always remain weak, anxious, and dependent on others. They will bend under pressure, cede ground, and fail to stand upright in the face of life's challenges. Nations are no different. India's decision to build and develop this missile was, in essence, the same as an individual choosing to rise above procrastination, negligence, and fear. It was the act of saying, I will prepare, I will be ready, I will not leave my security in the hands of others who may or may not have my best interests in mind. And this is what makes foresight the highest form of strength. It is the rejection of naivety in favor of responsibility. It is also necessary to understand that foresight is never easy. It demands resources, and it demands sacrifice. For India, this meant channeling scientific talent, economic investment, and political will into something that might not yield immediate returns. That is always the nature of planning for the future. You must give up what is comfortable today for the promise of security tomorrow. And this is a principle that resonates not only in statecraft, but in personal life. People who live paycheck to paycheck not because they must, but because they refuse to save, fall into cycles of dependency. They become vulnerable, fragile, subject to the whims of others. A nation that refuses to prepare for its defense lives under the same curse. Foresight requires saying, I will sacrifice now, I will endure the difficulty, so that when the moment of testing arrives, I am not found wanting. This missile, in that sense, became a material symbol of sacrifice, transformed into security. It is also worth recognizing the symbolic power of such a decision. When India unveiled this defense move, it was not just telling the world about a missile, it was telling itself a story. A story of strength, competence, maturity, and self-respect, because how a nation perceives itself is often as important as how others perceive it. When you see yourself as fragile, you act fragile. When you see yourself as weak, you invite domination. But when you see yourself as prepared, as strong, as capable, you act accordingly, and others must respond to that. This is the psychological essence of deterrence. It is not about what you do in the moment of conflict, but about how you prevent that moment from arising in the first place. India's foresight allowed it to tell a new story about itself. No longer passive, no longer reactive, but deliberate and commanding. The question arises, why does foresight inspire such respect? Because it is rare. Most individuals and most nations are driven by short-term impulses, the hunger of today, the anxiety of the present, the temptation of immediate gratification. Foresight, by contrast, requires vision that cuts across decades, perhaps even centuries. It requires placing yourself in the position of your descendants and asking, what will they inherit from me? Will it be security or danger? Will it be strength or fragility? In that sense, India's decision was not only for its present citizens, but for future generations. It was a gift of protection, a shield passed forward through time, and when a nation can think in that way, it elevates itself beyond the ordinary. It becomes something extraordinary, an example of long-term responsibility in a short-term world. The ability to project foresight is also the ability to project stability. Consider how nations behave toward one another. Respect is rarely given freely. It is demanded, often through strength. But strength without wisdom is dangerous, and wisdom without strength is ineffective. The balance, therefore, lies in combining both, and foresight is the bridge. With foresight, a nation wields its power carefully, avoiding unnecessary conflict while ensuring it is not threatened. India's missile program embodied precisely this balance. It was not a reckless pursuit of aggression, but a calculated act of restraint through preparation. The missile exists not so that it might be used, but so that it does not have to be. This is the paradox of deterrence. The weapon is most powerful when it remains silent, when it prevents rather than destroys, when its existence alone reshapes the field of possibility. What we must also consider is how foresight transforms identity. For an individual, planning ahead fosters self-respect, the quiet confidence of being capable and ready. For a nation, it generates international recognition, the acknowledgement that here stands a serious player, one who cannot be brushed aside. India's foresight in this case was not just a technical achievement, it was a cultural one. It signaled to the world and to itself that India was not a passive recipient of history, but an active shaper of it. This is why foresight is transformative. It redefines both perception and reality. And when others see you as strong, they treat you with caution, with respect, with acknowledgement of your rightful place. That is how foresight elevates a nation from regional vulnerability to global relevance. In the end, foresight represents the highest form of discipline. It is the act of seeing what others cannot, of preparing for storms before the clouds even gather. India, by developing and deploying this missile, engaged in precisely that discipline. It refused to wait for crisis, refused to let its destiny be dictated by others, refused to remain at the mercy of stronger players. Instead, it cultivated strength quietly, deliberately, strategically. That decision changed everything. It marked the transition from uncertainty to stability, from weakness to strength, from reactive to proactive, and it demonstrated to the world and to itself that foresight is the most intelligent, most transformative, and most responsible form of power any nation, or any individual, can ever wield. For centuries, observers have looked at India and seen chaos. They have seen crowded streets, countless languages, conflicting traditions, and political turmoil, and they have mistaken this for weakness. Yet chaos is not merely disorder. It is the raw material of transformation. Within chaos lies possibility, potential, and the seeds of order waiting to emerge. When India undertook the monumental task of building a missile capable of reshaping its defense posture, it was in fact demonstrating this principle. It took what seemed like fragmented potential and aligned it with purpose. Out of the multiplicity of voices came singular determination. Out of division came coordination. This is the essence of a nation moving from perception to reality, from chaos into order. Order does not arise by accident. It requires vision, discipline, and above all, the courage to impose structure on uncertainty. India's missile program was not a mere technical project. It was a symbolic act of nationhood, a declaration that even in the midst of complexity, direction could be found. When a scientist puts together fragments of knowledge, when engineers transform theory into steel, when leaders unify policy into coherent action, what is occurring is the transformation of chaos into form. That missile represented more than military strength. It embodied the collective will to bring order into being. Nations that remain perpetually chaotic are exploited by others. Nations that craft order from chaos demand respect. India, through its actions, moved itself into the latter category, and the world could not ignore it. If you think carefully, you will notice that chaos has always been the beginning of creation. Every life starts in the unknown. Every great endeavor begins with confusion and complexity. What matters is not the presence of chaos, but what one chooses to do with it. India's historical condition of diversity, fragmentation, and contradiction was precisely the kind of environment most nations would see as debilitating. Yet it was from this foundation that India forged scientific advancement, technological innovation, and strategic clarity. This is a profound psychological truth. You do not wait for perfect conditions to create order. You wrestle order out of the chaos you already inhabit. You accept imperfection, but you strive to align it with a higher goal. That is what transforms weakness into strength and fragility into resilience. The missile that emerged from this environment is not just a weapon. It is a metaphor for transformation. It is the crystallization of countless hours of labor, intellect, and perseverance against the odds. It is chaos disciplined, potential realized, ambition made tangible. When a nation like India demonstrates this ability, it provides a lesson for individuals as well. You cannot escape the chaos of life, but you can discipline it. You cannot remove the unpredictability of existence, but you can direct it. The missile is steel shaped by fire, but symbolically, it is order carved out of uncertainty. It shows the world that India, once viewed as fractured, now possesses the ability to impose structure on itself and project it outward as undeniable strength. We often misunderstand chaos because we fear it. To us, it feels like instability, like drowning, like something that must be avoided at all costs. But the truth is that chaos is the ground of all possibility. Without it, there is no growth, no change, no innovation. India's chaotic history, colonial subjugation, political instability, regional diversity was a kind of crucible. And in that crucible, pressure forged resilience. When India developed its missile program, it was not despite the chaos, but because of it. Out of disunity emerged a drive to unify. Out of past exploitation emerged the will to protect. Out of uncertainty emerged clarity of purpose. This is why the missile is not just a technological achievement, but a psychological and civilizational milestone. It is also necessary to see how order is never static. Once you impose structure, new chaos will inevitably emerge, demanding further refinement. India's missile program was not an endpoint but a beginning. It demanded ongoing research, maintenance, strategic thinking, and global diplomacy. The act of creating order from chaos sets in motion a cycle. New levels of stability reveal new layers of challenge. This is how growth operates for nations and for individuals alike. You never reach a final state of perfection. You continually balance chaos and order, moving forward with each challenge mastered. India, through this defense move, showed that it had entered into this cycle at a higher level. It proved that chaos was not its downfall, but its raw material. Consider also the perception of the outside world. Nations watching India expected disarray to continue indefinitely. They expected chaos to prevent progress, weakness to prevent power, confusion to prevent strength. But when India revealed its capacity to harness chaos into order, those expectations collapsed. The world was forced to recalibrate, to see India not as a passive participant, but as an active shaper of global dynamics. And this shift in perception is crucial, because power is not only about weapons. It is about how others believe you might use them. By demonstrating mastery over chaos, India created a new identity for itself. It was no longer merely surviving in disorder. It was commanding its own trajectory. That perception itself was a form of strength. The individual can take immense inspiration from this. Life itself is chaotic. You will encounter suffering, unpredictability, loss, and confusion. If you see these conditions as permanent weaknesses, you will be crushed by them. But if you, like India, recognize that chaos is the field of potential, then you can forge order out of it. You can decide to discipline your mind, organize your actions, and create stability in the midst of uncertainty. That is the path to competence, to respect, to strength. Just as India crafted a missile out of the chaos of its environment, so too can you craft your own order out of the disorder of your existence. This is not just a political lesson, but a psychological truth about human growth. Order emerging from chaos is one of the oldest archetypal stories in human culture. Myths across civilizations speak of gods imposing order on primordial disorder, of light breaking through darkness, of structure arising out of formlessness. India's missile program is a modern manifestation of that archetype. It is the story of a people long underestimated, deciding to impose order on their circumstances, to wrestle clarity out of confusion. And when such an act is undertaken, it resonates far beyond the technical achievement itself. It communicates to the world and to the people themselves that chaos can be mastered. It reinforces the belief that strength lies not in avoiding uncertainty, but in confronting it head-on. And it proves that even in the most fragmented environments, greatness can be forged. Power is an intoxicating force. History is littered with examples of individuals and nations who pursued it recklessly, who believed that the possession of strength was justification enough for its use. But power without responsibility is not stability. It is chaos cloaked in strength. On the other hand, responsibility without power is equally destructive, because it leaves a person or a nation defenseless, at the mercy of others who may not have benevolent intentions. The challenge is to balance both, to wield strength not as a weapon of tyranny, but as a shield of protection. India's decision to develop its missile program was a direct confrontation with this dilemma. It was an act of harmonizing responsibility with power. It demonstrated that true maturity is achieved only when both are integrated into one. Responsibility demands that you protect what you love, that you ensure the survival of your family, your community, your nation. Without that protective capacity, responsibility is nothing more than empty sentiment, a hollow claim easily shattered by external threats. India faced precisely this condition in its history. Vulnerability had left it open to invasions, exploitation, and domination. To declare responsibility without developing the power to uphold it would have been naive. And yet, to seek power for its own sake would have been equally dangerous, for such power degenerates into domination and fear. The missile represented a balance, the creation of strength not to conquer but to safeguard. It was responsibility armed with capability, wisdom crystallized into steel. When an individual grows into adulthood, they learn this balance instinctively. A father or mother who cares for their child does not stop at love. They must also cultivate the strength to protect, to provide, to guide. Responsibility compels them to gain competence, to build capacity, to prepare for adversity. Without that, their love is powerless, their responsibility empty. India, as a nation, stood in the same position. To claim responsibility for its people meant ensuring that it had the power to defend them. And this is where the missile program became not just a technological project, but a moral obligation. To build it was to take responsibility seriously. To neglect it would have been an abdication of duty. This is why the act carried profound psychological weight. It was not just strategy, it was moral maturity. We should remember that responsibility is not comfortable. It is heavy, burdensome, and often requires sacrifice. But it is precisely in accepting that burden that individuals and nations find meaning. When India chose to invest in defense, it diverted resources that could have been used for easier, more immediate gains. It chose long-term security over short-term comfort. That is the hallmark of genuine responsibility, the willingness to sacrifice today's pleasures for tomorrow's stability. Power built on sacrifice is different from power seized for conquest. One corrodes, the other sustains. India's missile was a product of sacrifice transformed into power, and thus it represented responsibility at its highest form. It was not reckless, it was deliberate, not arrogant but sober, not destructive but protective. The world notices when a nation accepts responsibility in this manner. Respect is not granted to those who cry out for protection. It is granted to those who can protect themselves. India, for decades, was perceived as a nation still recovering from weakness, still dependent on the goodwill of others. The missile changed that perception. It was a signal to the world that India had accepted the responsibility of sovereignty, that it would no longer outsource its security, that it was ready to bear the burden of power. And this shift matters immensely because the world respects strength aligned with responsibility. It fears power without responsibility, but it admires power wielded with restraint. India's action was precisely this. Power tempered by responsibility, projected outward as deterrence rather than aggression. If you look closely, you will see that responsibility is always linked to competence. To be responsible without the skill to act is to live in perpetual frustration and helplessness. A person who promises to care for their family but cannot earn a living is broken by the weight of unmet responsibility. A nation that promises security but lacks the means to provide it lives in the same condition. India's missile program was an act of competence. It was the technical, scientific, and organizational skill required to meet the responsibility of defense. Responsibility alone is idealism. Competence transforms it into reality. The missile was the visible form of that competence, a reminder that responsibility must always be coupled with the ability to act. Otherwise, both collapse under pressure. This is why power and responsibility must never be separated. Power without responsibility turns destructive, but responsibility without power turns futile. India, in choosing to arm itself responsibly, avoided both traps. It became a nation that could stand upright, bearing the weight of responsibility with the backbone of power. This balance is rare in history. Too often, nations have leaned into domination or weakness, and both paths invite disaster. Domination provokes rebellion and resentment, while weakness invites invasion and exploitation. The middle path, the disciplined union of responsibility and strength, is what builds stability. India's missile was a declaration of that middle path, a choice to balance its moral obligations with its material capabilities. It was wisdom forged in the crucible of necessity. The lesson here is not just geopolitical. It is deeply personal. Each of us faces the same challenge in life. You cannot be endlessly responsible without strength, because life's challenges will crush you. You cannot be endlessly strong without responsibility, because you will destroy others and yourself. The balance must be struck, and that is the path of meaning. India's missile is a large-scale example of what every person must learn individually. You must develop competence to support your responsibilities. You must build strength not to dominate, but to protect. You must cultivate discipline not to enslave, but to safeguard. This is the moral dimension of power, the ethical side of responsibility. It is what transforms you from fragile and reactive into stable and capable. The symbolic power of India's defense move, then, is immense. It told the world that India was no longer willing to live under the illusion of responsibility without the backing of power. It told its own people that their leaders were willing to shoulder the burden of security, to do the difficult work of preparation, and to embrace the sacrifices such responsibility requires. It represented maturity in national identity, a shift from dependence to autonomy, from weakness to strength, from naivety to realism. That is what true responsibility looks like: the willingness to align strength with duty, competence with obligation, power with restraint. It is what separates nations that rise from those that collapse, and individuals who grow from those who wither. Every individual faces a moment when they must decide whether to continue being defined by weakness or to rise into competence. That moment is terrifying because it demands confronting fear, chaos, and responsibility simultaneously. Nations face this moment too. For India, the decision to develop and deploy its missile program was precisely that kind of confrontation. It was the national equivalent of an individual standing tall and saying, "I will no longer be passive. I will no longer be defined by vulnerability." This was not just a military maneuver, it was a psychological transformation. It was the nation choosing strength over weakness, maturity over dependency, clarity over confusion. That missile was not only a weapon, it was a symbol of a nation's decision to grow up. When an individual faces fear, they are tempted to run from it, to avoid it, to bury it under distraction. But avoidance never leads to strength. It only magnifies fragility. India had lived through centuries of foreign domination, exploitation, and systemic weakness. To remain in that condition would have been to avoid responsibility. By creating its missile, India chose the opposite path, to confront fear directly, to say, "We will no longer leave our fate in the hands of others." That confrontation is always the first step to competence. Fear is not destroyed by denial, but by disciplined action. And the missile symbolized that disciplined action, a material representation of a nation facing its fear and transforming it into strength. Competence does not appear overnight. It is earned through struggle, error, persistence, and sacrifice. Just as an individual builds character through discipline, practice, and failure, so too does a nation build strength. India's missile program required decades of scientific work, organizational coordination, and cultural resilience. It was the embodiment of trial and error, of falling and rising again, of refusing to surrender to setbacks. This process is what competence looks like in practice. It is not perfection, it is persistence. It is not arrogance, it is humility in action, the humility to keep moving forward despite obstacles. That missile, therefore, was competence forged through perseverance. It was the outward expression of a nation's inner determination to grow. Growth, whether individual or national, requires sacrifice. You cannot rise without giving up something you once held dear. India's decision to prioritize defense meant channeling resources away from more comfortable, immediate pursuits. It meant embracing difficulty for the sake of future stability. This is no different from an individual who sacrifices leisure to build a career, who sacrifices ease to raise a family, who sacrifices comfort to pursue excellence. Sacrifice is the price of growth. The missile was not free. It was built on countless sacrifices made by scientists, leaders, and citizens who believed in a greater purpose. That willingness to sacrifice marked the nation's passage into maturity. It showed that India was willing to pay the cost of competence. The symbolic meaning of this cannot be overstated. When a nation decides to rise, it is not merely altering its weapons, it is altering its identity. For too long, India was defined externally, labeled as fragile, chaotic, or dependent. By developing its missile, it began to define itself. That is a profound shift, because identity shapes destiny. When you see yourself as weak, you invite domination. When you see yourself as capable, you project strength. India's missile program was not only a deterrent to adversaries, it was also a mirror for itself. It reflected back a new story, one of competence, maturity, and sovereignty. Nations, like individuals, must choose the story they will live by. India chose strength. This transformation illustrates a universal truth. Destiny is not handed down, it is created. An individual who waits for life to give them meaning will wait forever. A nation that waits for others to grant it power will remain weak. India's missile was an act of creation, a decision to write its own destiny rather than let others dictate it. And that is precisely what growth demands. You must seize responsibility for your future rather than resigning yourself to fate. You must build competence even when the world doubts you. You must create your destiny rather than accept one imposed upon you. India's missile was destiny forged into steel, a declaration of independence not only from enemies but from weakness itself. We often underestimate how deeply intertwined the fate of individuals and nations really is. Nations are built from the choices of individuals, and individuals draw inspiration from the strength of nations. When India decided to rise into competence, it offered an example to its people. It said, "We are not condemned to weakness. We can choose strength. We can create order. We can rise." That example, in turn, can inspire individuals to confront their own fears, to take responsibility for their own lives, to build competence in their own spheres. The missile, then, is not only a national defense mechanism. It is a cultural symbol, a reminder that growth is possible, that strength can be built, that destiny can be shaped. To confront weakness and embrace competence requires courage. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. India's history is full of suffering, exploitation, and vulnerability, yet courage emerged from that suffering. The missile was courage made visible. It was the act of saying, "We will not be defined by the past. We will not surrender to the weight of history. We will stand tall." This is the essence of courage, acting even when the risk is high, even when the future is uncertain. And courage is contagious. When a nation demonstrates it, individuals begin to believe they too can rise above their limitations. That is how transformation spreads, from the nation to the people, and from the people back to the nation. The development of competence always leads to responsibility on a higher level. Once you grow strong, the burden of protecting, guiding, and stabilizing increases. India's missile program was not just about defending its own territory. It was about stepping into a role as a global power, with responsibilities that extended beyond its borders. Growth always demands greater responsibility, An individual who becomes competent must care for others. A nation that becomes strong must act with restraint. This is the paradox of competence. The stronger you become, the more disciplined you must be. India's missile, therefore, was not just a weapon but a burden. It demanded maturity, responsibility, and wisdom equal to its power. That is the highest form of growth, competence tied to responsibility. When weakness is confronted and competence embraced, transformation occurs at every level. For the individual, it means moving from fragility to stability, from fear to courage, from naivety to wisdom. For the nation, it means moving from dependency to sovereignty, from vulnerability to deterrence, from fragmentation to unity. India's missile was a moment of transformation on this scale. It was a material representation of a psychological truth that destiny changes when weakness is confronted. It proved that even after centuries of suffering, a nation can rise. It proved that competence can be built, fear can be overcome, responsibility can be embraced. It was in every sense a story of transformation, a story that continues to inspire both nations and individuals alike.